Welcome to the Underwriting Intelligence Podcast. I'm Amrit. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Hyperexponential, and I'm your host. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Scott Stephenson, the former chairman, president, and CEO of Verisk, currently the chairman of the board at One Inc., as well as technology investor in SGS Capital. Scott, thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thank you for having me, Amrit. It's great to see you.
Thank you. I'm super excited to jump in. Yeah, wonderful. So maybe let's just jump right in. So you helped Verisk grow into a data and analytics leader in the insurtech insurance space and beyond. I'm really interested in how you thought and how you think today about building a technology company around a data moat. This is like one of the legendary aspirations for many companies. Very few succeed. You actually did it. So I'd love just to hear some of your insights on that journey.
Great question. The first thing I would say is Verisk should not be understood as an overnight sensation. Verisk at the opening of the 21st century had a particular opportunity to take advantage of the many very productive technology developments that were really emerging at that point. And what I particularly mean by that is we were seeing on a unit basis the cost of everything associated with being digital coming down, the cost of storage on a unit basis, of compute on a unit basis, of network. And so anybody who wanted to be on the data journey naturally had these tailwinds at work that were very productive with respect to period cost. And so over the course of the 22 years I was with the company, the data sets expanded massively, but the cost of gathering the data, positioning the data, et cetera, did not go up nearly as much. I mean, not even close. And so you had this naturally productive thing at work inside of your business. So that was kind of the modern tailwind that was put into a business that had actually been building data assets for decades. And so one of the things I want to say about the data journey is it can take time. It can take time. And actually, I think it is somewhat more difficult to assemble data, really proprietary data today than it was back then.
Yes.
And the reason is that the world has become persuaded, companies have become persuaded that their own data represents an asset that they need to be very careful with. I'm not saying in the year 2000, they didn't have questions in their minds. They did. But now, we've all been trained to understand that data really can be a differentiator. And so, and many of the data assets which are available to Verisk then and now were actually contributed by customers. And so you get to a very unique place if your customers are willing to grant you access and the privilege of making some use of some of their more or most sensitive and proprietary data. And that's the situation that Verisk is in. But what I'm trying to stress here is you don't get that overnight. You have to be trusted. You have to be deeply trusted. And even then, the next data element that you might have in mind that it would be good to try to capture, you're probably going to have to talk a lot about, okay, well, what are we going to do with the data? Why is this good for you, et cetera? And so it's so rewarding when you get there. It can be a long journey. And actually, I would say it has become somewhat more difficult than it used to be.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating insight. I think, as data, this phrase data became the new oil, became kind of a thing, people become much more sensitive to it. And, our industry is one that's notorious for this because, this concept of give to get in data is it's like an increasingly popular concept, but it's incredibly hard to break that. Actually, which bits of the data am I willing to pull and which bits do I want to keep? Because the core motivation, I think, is to see all of it as special. And I don't know, over that time when you were at Verisk, there was anything that came to you in the engagements, or whether it was truly a moment in time that led to people being willing to contribute to the data, collected data assets.
Well, I would say that one of the things that Verisk had going for it was that there was already a legacy of companies contributing, customers contributing data and seeing that it was well cared for and well supervised and stewarded. So, all of that made the request for the next new data element just that much more, likely to land. Um, but in terms of the developments over that period of time, I think that the primary way that you can seek to expand your proprietary data is to really be able to articulate what you will do with it, how
Yes.
you will protect it, why it's good for the one who's making it available to you. To be able to create a work paper which is about their ROI, not
Yeah.
your ROI, but their
Yes.
ROI for making the data available. Um, I think those are the things that you can do. Those
Hmm.
were the things that we tried to do.
Yeah, yeah, it's wonderful. A wonderful framing it, making it about their ROI, right? I think is the principle, and I think it's very easy to look internally, but looking externally, the focus on customer value is Startup 101, right? So it definitely applies to data as much as anything else.
I just throw out one other thought when I just interact with this whole idea of data and data onto insight, and that is, as I'm sure many of our listeners have probably experienced, no doubt you all, Amrit, in your shop, um, like you really realize what you're working with when, for example, you try to actually execute a contract which delineates data rights, which delineates rights in derivative works, and even tries to define what is a derivative work. And it gets pretty
It
complicated,
gets
and
gnarly.
and, and you have to do, every company has its own security team or third party data team or something, and this is what they do. They think about this, and so you actually have to get it right, customer by customer or data source by data source. It's a long journey.
Yeah, yeah, it really is, and you're exactly right. You know, the data rights side of things is so key. I remember when we set up HX, and the first thing we were one of the first true end-to-end cloud providers of analytics technology in the pricing and underwriting space back in 2017. And I remember the early clients saying to us, "So, what's to stop you collecting all of this incredibly valuable data? I'm about to put all of my pricing and underwriting tools, the lifeblood of my company on your cloud. What's to stop you putting all of that information together and selling it back to us?" And I remember just saying, "Look, you've just got much more expensive lawyers than we do, right? There is no danger of us even attempting to go and do that, right? We would never do that." Like, and the sanctity of that is so important. And just like we actually took that off the table, which people might go back and judge me as the wrong strategic decision. But as you say, the alarm bells that triggered at the start when HX was getting off the ground, it was a non-starter, right?
It's like, you in human relationships, we would often think in terms of dating and then dating seriously before getting married. Asking somebody for the rights and their data is like on the first date asking to get married.
It's very
And
good.
I don't think, that
Yeah,
probably more often than not, that's not going to work.
not going to
And
work, and you're going to scare them away, right? So it's
yeah,
very good.
well, I'll give you one other, kind of perspective when we're talking about data and the effect that it has. If you can put together a good data asset and it's operating in the center of the ecosystem. The United States, far and away, is the largest insurance market. We all know that. There are really two reasons for that. One of them is the United States is the single largest national economy. Well, there's really three reasons. The second is the structure of the industry, which is, there's a long list of insurers in the United States. It's a very large group. It's not as concentrated as many of the, major developed economies are in terms of the market shares of the insurers. But the third point I would make is a long time ago, the year 1945, the United States granted an antitrust exemption to the insurance industry called the McCarran-Ferguson Act, the effect of which, among other things, was to make it legitimate for insurance companies to have their data be pooled somewhere on the theory that it was pro-competition to make some of this very basic data about pricing and underwriting and loss claims, to somehow assemble all of that on the theory that if you and I wanted to go start a brand new insurance company writing auto cover in the state of Nebraska, like, okay, well, we have a problem. And the problem is we don't know what our cost of goods sold is likely to be. But if the data, so the theory of the case was if the data are all available, then essentially the data disadvantage has been removed or at least lessened for you and I as those
Got you.
budding.
Yeah.
And you know what? That is actually true. That is
Yeah.
actually really true.
Yeah.
So I wanted to say that partly to say, okay, so we're approaching an individual. I'm talking in terms of, customers, but it could certainly be third-party data sources as well. We approach a customer and we say, would you make your data available to me? There's this long history demonstrating that it's actually pro-competitive
Yes.
for data to be assembled in the center. So who's more likely to say, okay, yeah, I'll give you access to my data because I would like access to whatever you're going to do with all the data you're going to get? And the answer is the smaller share players,
Yes. Yes.
right?
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
there also another reason to be patient if you're trying to build data assets is for exactly this reason. You may have to start at the lower or middle tiers of the industry,
Mm,
get some adoption. At some point, maybe the total data that you're dealing with is greater than the amount of data in the hands of any one player.
yes.
And now the larger player may say, oh, well, I'd like to have access to that
Yeah,
too.
that's very smart. A critical mass actually strategy is very powerful. Um, that's awesome. How do you think about this in today's world, Scott, with AI? Right? More sources than ever are now tameable, right? You think about some of the filings in the past and how much of a titanic effort it was to even tame them into something, right? And then we had the API revolution, and now we've gone in the space of 2 years for that to being seen as a solved problem, right? With respect to data ingestion, parsing, integrations, they're getting easier and easier every day. What do you think this means for data providers? And I think it's also really interesting to think of people who are consumers of data. How do you think they should be adjusting their approaches on both sides of that?
Yeah. So I think, and I'd love for us to spend a few minutes on the competitive implications of
Yes.
what it is we're talking about here. But first, in terms of just the way it conditions the environment, absolutely right that uh, all of the technical methods which are a part of putting together an insight engine, which utilizes software and draws on content to do so, external, maybe internal also. Every bit of that technology kit can get assembled much more rapidly than in the past, right? So, uh, which to me, first of all, means the companies that are going to succeed are the ones that are actually um, emphasizing moving it into the future rapidly. I've always thought that speed was a virtue. I think it's even more of a virtue than it ever was. And so, commit yourself to sort of doing that. And then I think that the going in assumption should be that your ability to create advantage at any one moment in time for your business system as a vendor um, is probably about as great as it ever was, but the half life of whatever it is that you just came up with is decreasing. And therefore, there's only one way, and that is forward and faster. Um, and I would warn anybody against thinking that, well, okay, we've got a large share of the market and we've got multi-year contracts, and therefore you wouldn't use this language, but like we're going to start charging monopoly rents.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
I would not do that.
No, and I think your framing through the competitive lens is really powerful. And, I think one of the discontinuities we're seeing in the markets with AI more broadly is just how much more is possible quickly, right? And I think what that does is it's an incredible competitive leveler, isn't it? I'm an actuary by training, and I always used to use this like slightly corny analogy that, if you're a chef cooking up a recipe, Sorry, if you're doing some pricing or underwriting, it's like a chef cooking up a meal. You have a recipe, you have some ingredients, and you have the utensils, right? So the ingredients are the data, the utensils are your tools, right? And the recipe is the algorithm. You get all of those things right, you get a wonderful meal, right? And all of a sudden, if you look at like just an explosion in the possible number of ingredients, right? It transforms, and actually the utensils, right? Like it transforms what's possible. And I think you're absolutely right to focus in on the competitive landscape, because I think it is going to be, it feels like a logical consequence, right? That there's going to be new ways to derive insights that maybe wouldn't depend on a single source or a legacy asset that's endured for many, many years. And that's only good. Again, thinking about the pro consumer aspect, is only a good thing ultimately.
Well, let me pick up on your food analogy and maybe expand on it a little bit. So, if our goal is to see we're a business and our goal is to see somebody else fed, we can feed them in a number of ways. We can assemble peas and carrots and sell them peas and carrots. We can create, I'm not sure what the equivalent is in the UK. I'm sure there are a dozen of them, but in the United States, we've had things like you get a box and it's got dry ice in the bottom of it. You get all the ingredients, you get the special sauces, and you get the recipe. You get all of it. So you got all the ingredients, they've been assembled for you. You got the recipe, you got you got the difference making stuff, and then but you still do the work. Or the third thing we can do, so we could sell people that blue apron, or we could make a dinner in the kitchen and plate it and put it down in front of the people that we want to have eat. The thing I find myself thinking about a lot in the modern world is, it used to be that the largest customers in a B2B world were always kind of thinking like, can I get away with just buying peas and carrots from you? And maybe I can do all the rest, right? They would always think that way. In the AI motion, that thought is going to occur to a lot more companies that are smaller. It used to be that one of the tests was, do I have enough resource inside to be able to do that? This is being developed and handed to companies, this ability to kind of do it yourself more than used to be the case. And so I think that we should be thinking, I think there are a couple of strategic implications. And one of them is, be prepared for if there's more of that in the world.
Yeah, yeah, agreed, agreed. That's a really nice segue onto something I was thinking a lot about when I was thinking about this conversation. Insurtech's a fascinating sector, right? If you look, someone I was talking to, we had a good year last year at HX, and someone said, "Do you know, Amrit, you're probably one of the biggest insurtechs of this generation." I thought to myself, we still feel absolutely tiny, right? And I think if you look at the distribution of insurtechs in the last 10 years or more, there's like a couple of huge ones, then lots and lots of tiny ones, and then a couple of mid-sized ones. I still put HX in the kind of small to medium-sized business in the grand scheme of things. Um, how do you think about, having led one of the world's leading, preeminent ones, how do you think about partnerships? And, if you were to advise me, you know, coming to work with a business like the one you led, how do you like advise us to set up these partnerships to be effective, beneficial, and, like to set in the face of that asymmetry, driving customer value? Because it's very hard, I think, you know, everyone wants to do the right thing by its customers, but organizational coherence between companies of different sizes makes it actually quite hard to get results. I don't know
A
if you've
hundred
got any
percent.
experience of that and what you saw on the other side.
Yeah. It's a great question. The first thing is, you're absolutely right that there is sort of a barbell, and by count of logos, there are so many more at the one end of the barbell,
Yes,
the smaller end
that's
of the
right.
barbell. So you're right about that. I also think actually that the lest we fall into kind of an unexamined way of looking at the biggest ones and saying, oh, okay, well, they have every advantage, so they're going to sort of remain there. I think that actually that's not, in fact, the right way to think about it, because um, there can actually be, if you become sufficiently large in the eyes of your customers, that can be a reason for them to look for somebody else to buy from. I mean, it actually, I I had these conversations a lot with the CEOs of our insurance company friends. It was, they respected what we were doing, et cetera, but they were aware of the absolute amount of money that they were paying us. And they felt like that was something that they should be responsible about. And so, you become more the focus of the procurement team. And so I just want to kind of, life is, if there's kind of a way of framing it, which is like, life is so hard at the emerging side of this barbell, and life is so easy at the other end of this barbell, that I actually don't think that's true. And in fact, the big guys should be doubly paranoid about where they sit in the world and where things are going. I just believe that that's a condition which is out there. And honestly, also, I think it is demonstrable that the amount of, so at the scale of HX, for example, in your category, the amount of your budget which you are spending on essentially product and product enhancement as a percentage of revenue, as a percentage of anything, is much greater than at the big guys. So now just sum up all of that form of innovation over there. At the end of the day, how is the customer, meaning the broad set of customers in the, in the insurance world, where are they going to get more served, on a go forward basis? And you can hear my bias, which is 20 years ago, I would have leaned in, I would have acknowledged the challenges to being the big guy, but I would have also cited more advantages. I don't think the advantages are, I think the challenges are greater. The advantages are lower, and the premium is really going to go to who's got a great solution. And by the way, we might think of the companies at the small end of the spectrum as point solutions. That's something that, that's a phrase that gets put out there all the time. But how hard is it to buy a point solution going forward if the customer is agent supported? You are, as the vendor, you're agent supported. Basically, the agents are finding each other. Like, how much, are you, whatever the supposed advantages are of being the bigger guy, surely they reduce in a world like that.
Yeah, I love that. I think about this a huge amount. The people have been talking about SaaSmageddon, the SaaS apocalypse, and one of the implied theses is that the idea that you can have a point solution now in the world where agentic software development and agentic coordination make, creating value much easier. The idea is that that's a little bit over. I think, I'm a little bit biased, right? But I still believe deeply in the value of vertical software. I don't know how you think a little bit about this, like where specialism is valuable and where it's not in today's world.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the right place to take the conversation to. And here's, I'll give you a high level, and then I'll kind of drill in a little bit. So most people have heard the phrase, the best defense is a good offense. In the current moment, with the lightweight agility that comes with the AI enabled tooling, et cetera, I really think the right way to think about your business, if you're digitally grounded, you're in a B2B context, is the only offense is offense. And about the only thing you can do to amplify your defense is offense. And so because, take what you guys do at HX. So I'm sure you've mapped your ecosystem, and around you would be players that do some of the things that you do, and they're kind of like you, but they're different than you, right? All that. The reason the SaaS apocalypse is the market reacting to something which is true, which is somebody that's surrounding you and wants to push in on where you are right now. Generating the code, which is a part of pushing in on you, is just becoming faster, easier, right? So that's why, SaaS companies lost how many turns over the last, few weeks, it's actually an overreaction. And, the ones that understand where advantage comes from, which is data, hopefully longitudinal, context, depth of customer relationship, like those have always been defensible, and they still are. But the probability that somebody that is interested in your space will use this new AI fabric and generate software, which first order would appear to do what yours does, and then at almost zero incremental cost, start trying to put that into your market. Be ready for that. And so, okay, so you've got your traditional moat. Expect more of this. The one thing that I think that the emergent focused technology players need to get into their heads, and I don't think most of them have it in their heads yet. Maybe it's that most of their investors don't have it in their heads yet, is part of your countermeasure is to push out. You're going to get pushed in on, push out. Like whatever is adjacent to you, and they could generate some code base in 2 days, right? Well, how about you generating a code base facing them and moving the other direction in 2 days?
Yeah, it's so true. And, it's so important, I think, to reset the internal expectation of what's possible, right, inside businesses, right? But I think for, this phrase best of breed is very funny, isn't it? Point solution, best of breed. Like, I think it almost like lionizes the idea that just doing one thing is a good thing. And I like, for a long time when HX was growing up as a business, we still are, but like, we absolutely stuck to the philosophy of focus being very, very important. But I think one of the things that I'm resetting at the company now is to think about all of the tasks that we have to do in service of our customers' needs. Like, actually there is much more that's possible with an agentic toolkit. And we need to not let that focus become an excuse, right, for not pushing out, to use your phrase. It's a fascinating organizational a change.
Well, I'd be interested to ask you a question, which is, whoever it is that is calling on your customers, the relationship with a customer can be sort of like, in a business like yours, or the business that the relationship can sort of be like, okay, tell me where your loading dock is. I'll back my truck up to it. And at the loading dock, I'll drop off whatever I've got. If you're going to push back, if you're going to push out on whoever's pushing, you have to know what's going on beyond the loading dock. And so can our go-to-market teams really be that market intelligence also? It's not the way that salespeople normally think of themselves, and it's also not actually maybe what they've been trained for. But I think that's the art of doing it well, is like, how can your go-to-market team also be the most privileged market intelligence capability that your company has and can access?
Yeah, yeah. I think you've touched on something which people aren't talking about as much today, which I think is really interesting and very important, which is, you know, I'm learning this as HX over the last year has become multi-country and multi-territory, right? 3 years ago, European, UK specialty pricing and rating, that's what we did. Now we are, full cycle underwriting, big presence in the US. And so I've watched my company go multi-product, multi-sector. And, historically, that came with a huge requirement to reskill and enable the go-to-market teams on different slices of the product. And what I think is happening now is actually in the same way that it's incumbent on our product teams to be much broader, that loading bay, the go-to-market teams actually have to have a much wider aperture, because you can't go in and go, actually, you know what, I just sell you pricing and rating. Because I'd be like, sorry, pricing and rating's a feature now. You don't sell me that. I buy underwriting technology. And so the AEs, the marketing teams, they all have to, exactly as you say, have their ears tuned to think about the customer problem rather than the product they're selling. And of course, the best go-to-market people always do that anyway, but it was much more militarized, right? Different units, different people. And I think you're going to see the collapse on the go-to-market side just as much as you see the collapse on the product side, I think, in terms of
That's, I think
capabilities.
yeah, I think that's a very reasonable hypothesis.
Yeah. I'd be
Yeah.
very, very interested to see how it plays out. So maybe before we wrap, I'd love to just hear your perspective as a technology investor today. One of the most valuable things, precious things I find about our conversation is just to get your overarching macro view of what you're thinking about. And I know you're not an insurtech specialist, but you definitely know a lot about it. How do you assess what makes a great insurtech today? As you've seen just, probably even in the last 6 months, radical transformations as to what's possible.
Yeah. Well, I would go back to the topic of leadership and say that I think that there's marketplace leadership, which exists today, and there's human leadership on top of that marketplace leadership. And assuming that the current definition of the market being served is large enough relative to the size of the company today. If I've got the human leadership, I've got the marketplace leadership, which includes ideally unique data assets, highly contextualized to the problems being solved, and uniquely good relationships with customers. So if I've got human leadership, I've got that kind of marketplace leadership, and I've got a use cases whose, we talk about TAM, the TAM underneath those is large enough. That starts out as being investable in my mind. Like I get interested in that. The secret sauce, then, I would put it this way, and this is going to exist at the intersection of the executive leaders of the team and the core investors in the business. I would put it this way, using the analogy of running the 100 meters. Okay, so you're Usain Bolt, right? And you're out of the blocks and you're running, and you're 30 meters in or whatever. The primary signal I would imagine that he's reading is my mechanism working? Okay, like, is everything doing what I think it's supposed to do? Is there a little bit more there? Can I call on it? I mean, you've done it so many times, so you're feeling the mechanism and you're feeling, and you're moving at the pace you're moving at. And I would add, when you're running the 100 meters, you can get a sense of the competition. It's interesting how frequently the Olympic athletes are actually looking at the big screen at the end to, am I winning? And you can also, you can sort of glance to the right or the left, and that can send you a signal. Should I step on the gas a little bit more? Do I need it? Do I need it right now? Kind of like that. So I think you're primarily reading your own mechanism, but to a degree, you can also read signals from around you, right? The issue with what's the opportunities that exist today is there's no looking to the right or the left. There is no, so everybody that occupies your seat, Amrit, leading an exciting company, are we going fast enough? And the answer is, the only one who's going to determine the answer to that is essentially you. And then are your investors with you in terms of your view of that? But, and so there's something about, do you get that you must be at maximum pace right now? And do all the constituents agree? Because there's lots of subtle ways to slow down. It's okay, tell me again the profitability of that product, or, something like that. That's, it's a reasonable question, but it also actually, now you're answering that question rather than what you would be doing to be going faster. So we're all I want to be engaged with a company that feels like it needs to be Usain Bolt, the fastest one in the world, one, and two, is mostly reading its own signals, as opposed to, when I see something that tells me I need to speed up, then I will speed up.
Yeah.
Because where are you going to get those signals from?
Yeah, I love that. That's really differentiated investing hypothesis, actually. I think it's very interesting, isn't it, what you said there about, particularly today. I had this conversation with the board just last week, actually. It was very, very interesting. Just we have to re-underwrite that now. Right, we have to re-underwrite what world-class velocity is. It's not percentage points faster. It's magnitudes faster.
I was having that discussion just yesterday with one of the companies I'm invested in. Exactly that same thing. Re-underwrite. Yeah, exactly. But that fundamental, and it's hard to get at that. It's because you can have a successful track record, but not necessarily think I need to be as fast as Usain Bolt, or necessarily think I have to basically read my own mechanism and just push it faster. You might think somebody will give me a benchmark, or a customer will tell me I need to do this, and then I will do it.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the right approach.
No, no, I agree with you. I agree with you. And certainly not in today's world, right? I think, totally agree. Scott, I think that's a wonderful place to wrap up, actually. We've got to re-underwrite the pace and set our internal benchmarks. Look, that has been one of the highest signal conversations we've had on this show. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for your support.
Oh, what a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Let's do it again.
Wonderful. That's it for this episode of the Underwriting Intelligence Podcast. I hope you found it useful and thought-provoking. If you did, don't forget to follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you know someone in insurance who'd find this valuable, please share it with them. I'm Amrit, and I'll be back in 2 weeks with more insights that matter in the insurance world. Until then, thanks for listening.